I didn't expect to feel anything when he walked back into our house. After all, he had grown up here. His room was still upstairs, barely touched. But now, years later, a man stood in the doorway where a boy had once been. He looked older. Then I remembered, not just in the face, but in the way he stood, like someone who had lived through something he wasn't yet ready to name. My husband greeted him first, of course. Their exchange was polite, practical, filled with the kind of phrases that fill up space but mean nothing. I stood by the staircase, arms folded over my chest, pretending I was just a spectator. But I wasn't. I noticed the weight of his suitcase. I noticed the way he looked at the kitchen as if it were a museum exhibit. I noticed the pause before he looked at me. We hadn't seen each other in 5 years. A lot had happened in that time. For him, a failed marriage. For me, a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt cold inside. When he finally said my name, it was softer than I expected. I gave him a quick, rehearsed smile and told him his old room was ready. I didn't expect the way my skin reacted when he brushed past me. The heat that lingered after his shoulder barely grazed mine. I told myself it was nostalgia, nothing more. That night, we had dinner together. My husband opened a bottle of white wine, the same kind we always drank on weekends. He talked about work, his voice steady and familiar, the kind of sound that becomes part of the furniture. I responded when appropriate, passed dishes, asked questions. I played the role I'd mastered. Across the table, the man who was once my stepson didn't say much. He listened, nodded, observed. At one point, I glanced up and caught him watching me, not in a crude way, not even in an inappropriate one. Just watching, like he was trying to remember who I was or figure out who I had become. I looked away quickly, my throat suddenly dry. Later, while my husband loaded the dishwasher, I stepped out onto the porch with a glass of wine. It was cool for early spring, the kind of air that made your skin remember it was alive. A few moments later, I heard the door creak. I didn't turn around. "You always like to sit out here," he said behind me. His voice was deeper now. He wasn't trying to make conversation. He was making a statement. "I still do," I replied, and took a slow sip. Not trusting myself to say more, we stood in silence. I could feel him behind me, not close, but not far enough. That space between us pulsed with something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't attraction. Not yet. It was recognition. The kind that exists only between two people who remember each other differently than they should. When I went to bed that night, my husband was already asleep, one arm flung over his pillow like a claim. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, the image of another man's eyes quietly folding itself into the dark corners of my mind. The next morning, I woke before everyone else. I made coffee, tied my robe tighter than usual, and avoided the hallway that led to his room. But he was already in the kitchen when I came in, shirtless, just a towel slung low around his hips. He reached up for a mug, exposing the curve of his back, the definition of muscle beneath his skin. My eyes flicked away before he turned. "Morning," he said casually, like nothing was strange about standing half-naked 2 feet away from me. "Coffee's fresh," I muttered, pouring a second cup I didn't want. He took it from me, his fingers brushing mine. A flash of something hot, uninvited, coursed through my hand. I stepped back, pretending to fix the hem of my robe. He didn't say anything more. He just leaned against the counter and sipped. Calm. And still, that day passed in slow motion. Every room I entered, I checked if he was there. Every time he wasn't, I felt both relief and disappointment. My husband suggested a movie that night, something he'd already half-watched alone the week before. I sat beside him on the couch, my body warm under a blanket, but my thoughts cold and distant. Around 11, I went to bed. I lay there for a long time, listening to the house breathe. At some point, I heard footsteps, not heavy like my husband's, softer, slower. They stopped outside our door for a few seconds, then continued down the hall. I didn't sleep. My fingers traced invisible lines across my stomach under the sheets, and I wondered what it meant that I needed that small gesture to feel present. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, like the first crack in ice before it breaks. and I had no idea if I wanted to stop it. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened. That was my way of coping. Sealing. The cracks before anyone noticed, I made breakfast. Eggs, toast, orange juice. My husband kissed my temple, thanked me, and stepped onto the porch with his laptop. He often worked out there lately, claiming the fresh air helped him focus. I didn't object. We had grown used to silence. It had become a feature of our marriage, like the wedding photos gathering dust in the hallway. He came down later, dressed. Hair still damp from the shower, he wore a button-down shirt, and there was something about the way the fabric clung to his frame that caught me off guard. Maybe it was the way he moved. Maybe it was how he didn't rush. He said, "Morning." As he poured himself coffee, I dried my hands on a towel, suddenly hyper-aware of my own skin, and how it seemed to react to the sound of his voice before I even processed his words. I talked about the weather. He replied, "Everything stayed within bounds. Everything but my gaze, which briefly landed on his hand, on the bend of his wrist where the veins curved delicately beneath the skin. I looked away, too fast, as if caught staring at something I shouldn't even notice. He left for a run. I stayed behind, alone, and wandered into our bedroom. Without quite knowing why, the mirror above the dresser caught me off guard. I saw a woman I couldn't fully recognize, her hair slightly unkempt, eyes too clear, lips slightly parted. I unbuttoned my blouse. Underneath it, a plain white bra. Old? Functional? I slipped it off without looking and reached for the back of the wardrobe. Hidden in a box I rarely touched was something I had bought years ago. For myself, not for anyone else. Burgundy lace, soft, almost wine-colored. When I slipped it on, something in me settled, or awakened. I wasn't sure which. I wasn't dressing for my husband. I wasn't even dressing for the man upstairs. I was dressing to remember I still had a body that wanted to be remembered. I heard him come back. The front door creaked, followed by soft footsteps and the sound of a phone call cut short. I didn't go out to see him. I stayed in the bedroom, pulling on a long-sleeve shirt over the lingerie. I dabbed on a hint of perfume, then wiped it off again. Nervous it said too much. Still, the scent lingered, faint but undeniable. The day passed. I cleaned, cooked, ran errands. My husband came home with a box of sushi and a dry remark about hosting colleagues on Monday. I nodded, and he disappeared into his office. I didn't follow. I didn't ask about the meeting. I didn't want to know who he would become once the door closed. Later that evening, he came into the kitchen while I was slicing a lemon. He leaned casually against the doorframe, saying nothing. But I felt his gaze. The way it moved across my shoulders, paused at my neckline, followed the movement of my hands. I didn't lift my eyes. Only when he stepped closer and set a glass on the counter. Did I look up? He had poured me wine, my favorite, the one I hadn't bought in months. "You don't smile much," he said. I paused. Fingers still wrapped around the knife handle. "Smiling doesn't always mean happy," I murmured, barely audible. We stood like that for a while. He at the window, me by the stove. The space between us held something too thick for words, too delicate to touch. When I walked past him, his hand brushed my waist, lightly, as if testing whether I would pull away. I didn't. Later that night, after my husband had fallen asleep, I stayed in the living room with a magazine I wasn't reading. I heard footsteps upstairs, then silence. I turned off the lamp and walked into the hallway. His door was ajar. I stood outside it, listening to my own breathing, frozen for a few seconds, maybe more. "You can't sleep?" His voice said softly. I didn't go in. I remained by the door. "It's late," I said. "I know." The quiet that followed felt louder than anything. I clutched the fabric of my robe as if grounding myself in something tangible. "Good night," I said, and turned back toward the bedroom. When I lay beside my husband, he shifted slightly but didn't wake. His hand flopped across the sheets, reaching for nothing. I stared at the ceiling, my heart hammering. Half an hour later, I got up again. I didn't make excuses. Even to myself, I moved barefoot across the hallway. He stood by the window in a dark t-shirt, his back to me. I entered, he turned, I began. He didn't need me to explain. He took a step forward, slow and careful, and reached out, not to grab, not to demand, but to trace the line of my cheek with his fingers, barely touching. As if confirming I was real, I didn't move. The kiss wasn't sudden. It wasn't aggressive or fumbling. It was quiet, deliberate. The kind of kiss that says, I see you, not I want you. And yet I felt my body lean into his as if it had been waiting. Not for this man, specifically, but for the permission to feel again. When I slipped back into bed, my husband was still sleeping. I lay perfectly still, my eyes wide open, the sheets cool around me, my pulse loud in my ears. I hadn't planned it, I hadn't fantasized about it. And yet, it had happened. Not like a mistake, but like something inevitable I hadn't dared to name until now. The next morning came too quickly. Light filtered through the curtains in strips, exposing everything the dark had tried to hide. I lay awake long before my husband stirred, my body still, my mind loud. I had always thought guilt would arrive in loud crashes, doors slamming, screams echoing. But it didn't. It arrived quietly, in the form of questions I didn't want to answer. He greeted me as usual, pecked my cheek, and mentioned something about needing to be at the office earlier than planned. I nodded, feigned interest in his schedule, and focused on pouring his coffee with steady hands. He left with a briefcase in one hand and a distracted "love you" that disappeared before I could reply. The house felt different once the door clicked shut, not silent, heavy, like the air had absorbed what we had done and didn't know where to release it. I walked into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My lips were slightly swollen, but not in a way anyone else would notice. My eyes, though, they looked different, sharper, like they had finally woken up after years of sleepwalking. I didn't see him until later that afternoon. I had thrown myself into chores, trying to scrub away the electricity still humming beneath my skin. By the time I stepped out onto the porch, he was already there, sitting on the railing with a yay book in his lap. He looked up, and for a moment, the air between us stalled. He didn't smile. Neither did I. I leaned against the wooden beam, arms crossed. Not as a shield, but to keep from reaching. His eyes dropped to my hands, then back. Up, you okay? He asked. I nodded once. Just tired. He closed the book, setting it beside him, and stretched his legs out. I watched the way his fingers rested on his thigh, casual but alert, like every part of him was paying attention, even in stillness. The silence returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was sharp, precise. Every glance, every breath meant something. I didn't know what we were doing, only that we were both aware of what had already been done. That evening, my husband announced we'd be attending a company dinner for their anniversary, a formal event at a country estate about an hour from town. He said he wasn't sure he could make it, but it would be good if someone from the family showed up. A diplomatic appearance. I was used to being that. I could drive her, came the voice behind me. I turned, startled to see him leaning in the doorway, one hand in his pocket. My husband looked up from his laptop. If you don't mind, that would help. I almost said no, almost invented a reason, but my throat closed around the protest before I could form it. Sure, I said. That's fine. The next day, I dressed carefully, not provocatively, but intentionally, a dark red dress, modest in shape but clinging in the right places. Underneath, black lace I hadn't worn in years, not for anyone. To see, just to feel the difference between skin and silk. Perfume on my wrists, hair pulled up, not too tight. He waited by the car. When I stepped out, he looked at me in a way that forced me to look down. Though I didn't want to, I saw his throat move as he swallowed. Neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. The drive was long, but the silence stretched comfortably. Occasionally, he'd glance sideways. Once, at a red light, our eyes met. Longer than necessary, he didn't speak. His hand rested on the gear shift close to mine. I could feel the warmth of it without touching. The venue was elegant, lit by hundreds of small lights strung between old oaks. Music played in the background, and clusters of people in suits and dresses floated past like well-rehearsed shadows. I greeted the ones I recognized, smiled when expected, made small talk that felt like smoke. At one point, he stood beside me at the refreshment table. Our hands reached for the same glass. We both paused, fingers brushing. I didn't pull away. He didn't either. That 1 second contained more clarity than entire years of routine. We slipped away quietly before dessert. Not because we planned to, but because the idea of staying felt unbearable. The car ride back was darker, quieter. I could hear the engine, the tires humming over pavement, the occasional exhale from his side. Halfway home, it started raining. Not a storm, just a gentle, constant tapping. He turned on the wipers. We didn't speak. I watched the streaks the raindrops left across the windshield, each one erased by the blades before it had time to settle. A metaphor I didn't want to admit felt too real. When we arrived, the house was dark. My husband had left a note. Emergency call from a client. Wouldn't be home until late. I read it once and folded it slowly, as though it might change if I gave it time. He stood near the coat rack waiting. I didn't move to turn on the light. I walked past him toward the living room. He followed. We didn't speak. Even as I turned and looked at him. Even as I reached up and touched the collar of his jacket. Even as he took a step closer and placed his hand gently at the small of my back. The kiss this time wasn't hesitant. It wasn't soft. It was deliberate, slow. The kind of kiss that fills a room. I felt it in my throat and the soles of my feet. He kissed me like someone who had been waiting. Not for the right moment, but for the moment he no longer cared whether it was right. We didn't undress. We didn't rush. It ended with nothing. More than the sound of my breath catching in my chest, and the way he rested his forehead against mine like a silent apology. Later, I lay awake again. My husband still gone. My dress on the chair. The lace beneath it a second skin I could no longer pretend I hadn't chosen for him. I thought I knew what desire felt like. But this wasn't about sex. It was about being seen. And I realized, maybe for the first time, how long I had lived without that. I woke the next day before dawn, unsure whether I had slept at all, or simply drifted in and out of restless thought. The house was silent again, still wrapped in the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, only suspended. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the pattern on the hardwood floor, letting the numbness settle like dust on my skin. In the soft gray light, everything looked sharper. My dress from the night before lay draped over the back of the chair, creased and faintly perfumed. My heels were still by the front door, one tilted onto its side. The black lace I had worn was folded neatly on the bathroom counter, as if I had wanted to preserve the illusion of order, of control. But the truth was something had shifted in me, not violently, just permanently. When I made coffee, my hands moved on instinct, grinding, pouring, stirring. But my mind wasn't in the kitchen. I kept hearing the sound of rain on the car roof. The moment his fingers touched my waist, the breath he drew before, kissing me like he couldn't unlearn the shape of my mouth. I thought of the way we didn't talk afterward, of how he didn't ask me for anything, of how I didn't offer an apology. I didn't want one. He came down late, his hair still wet. From a shower, a navy t-shirt clinging slightly at the shoulders, he looked composed, as if whatever had happened hadn't scattered him the way it had unraveled me. But then again, men were good at that. Wearing the surface like armor while everything underneath boiled, we moved around each other like magnets turned the wrong way. I passed him the sugar. He handed me a plate. Nothing in our gestures acknowledged the night before, and yet everything did. Our hands lingered for fractions of seconds too long. Our gazes flickered and then dropped, like the heat. Between us was a secret we both wanted to protect and expose at once. That afternoon, I opened the door to find a plain brown box on the porch. No label, no note. Inside was tissue paper, and beneath it, lingerie, dark emerald, not vulgar, elegant, detailed. My breath caught. I knew instantly it was from him. The fabric was cool under my fingertips, the lace pattern intricate, delicate, unmistakably chosen with care. Not lust, attention. I stood in the doorway for a long time holding the box, the silence behind me like a verdict. I didn't tell my husband about it when he got home. He wouldn't have asked. He was preoccupied with a new project. During dinner, he spoke at length. about budgets, contractors, timelines. I nodded where appropriate, chewed slowly, smiled when I was supposed to. But my skin still carried the memory of another man's eyes on my bare collarbone. After dinner, I cleared the plates while the television hummed in the background. He was half watching, half scrolling through his phone. I knew his patterns by now, what distracted him, what he'd ignore, what he would assume was fatigue or hormonal shift, or just my usual quiet. He didn't notice the way I lingered at the sink, or how my hand trembled slightly when I turned off the faucet. That night, I stood in front of the mirror wearing the emerald lingerie. The strap sat perfectly on my shoulders, the cut lifted and exposed in just the right places. I didn't recognize myself immediately, not because I looked different, but because I felt different. Not younger, not prettier, just more awake. There was something thrilling in knowing he had chosen this for me without a word, that he had understood not just my body, but the part of me that had been neglected, not by cruelty, but by years of being gently forgotten. I put on a sweater and loose pants over it, the kind of clothes that made me invisible. I told myself I was only wearing it because I wanted to feel it against my skin, that I wouldn't let him see. But I walked into the living room and saw him there, reading. He glanced up and stopped. His eyes held mine longer than necessary. They flicked down, then back up. No smile, no words. But I knew he knew. I sat across from him and pulled a blanket over my lap. I said nothing, neither did he. My husband was already asleep by the time I went to bed. I slid under the covers beside him and closed my eyes. I tried to focus on his breath, the familiar rise and fall of his chest. I tried to sync mine with his, but it was like trying to find rhythm in a song you no longer remembered how to hum. The next morning, I wore the lingerie beneath a plain gray dress. I made eggs, toast, sliced fruit. When I leaned over the table to hand my husband his plate, he smiled and pecked my cheek again. Habit, reflex, across the table. The man who had chosen the lace watched the curve of my wrist, the inside of my elbow, the line of my throat. Our eyes met for a second. He knew I was wearing it. I knew he knew. It wasn't a game. It wasn't teasing. It was communion. Wordless. Dangerous. I took my coffee outside and sat on the edge of the porch, the mug warm in my hands. The wind tugged at the hem of my dress, just enough to remind me of what lay underneath. He followed me out a few minutes later and sat beside me. Not too close, just near enough that I could smell the faint remnants of cologne and shampoo and something distinctly his. "You wore it," he said, not asking. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We watched the sky for a long time. Clouds drifted slowly, the way time does when it wants you to notice it. The air between us didn't hum. It ached. And beneath, my clothes, the lace pressed softly against my skin like a memory I hadn't yet made. He reached for my hand once, not to hold it, just to let our fingers touch. Barely. The contact was brief, deliberate, and entirely enough to undo me. That night, I lay in bed unable to decide which feeling scared me more, the guilt of what I'd already done, or the want for what I knew would happen next. It was my husband who suggested the weekend trip, a work obligation, a corporate event, something at a countryside inn just beyond the city. He had originally intended to go himself, but a last-minute conflict meant he couldn't. The invitation had already been accepted, the deposit already paid. He asked if I would represent him. Said yes before I had the chance to consider what that meant. Before I realized that he would ask the man upstairs to drive me. "You trust him, don't you?" My husband asked lightly, halfway through shaving, the bathroom mirror steaming around his reflection. I hesitated. "Of course," I replied, and he smiled, satisfied, as if it had never occurred to him that trust might be a variable in our equation. The morning of the trip was overcast. The sky hung low, pale and uncertain. I packed minimally, a change of clothes, toiletries, makeup I rarely wore anymore, and lingerie, not for a man. For the woman I used to be before I started, prioritizing softness over edge, neutral tones over hunger. He was waiting in the driveway, leaning casually against the driver's door. A black jacket, dark jeans, hair slightly tousled in a way that didn't look rehearsed. When I stepped outside, suitcase in hand, his eyes tracked me from porch to pavement. He didn't speak. He opened the trunk and took the bag from me. The drive began in silence. Not avoidance. Anticipation. The air between us was charged, the kind of tension that made your skin aware of every passing second. The closer we got to the inn, the more I felt the distance from my ordinary life, stretched thin behind us like a thread being pulled taut. The place itself was beautiful, an old converted vineyard with a long gravel driveway and ivy climbing the stone walls. The receptionist smiled warmly, typing our last name into the system. She looked briefly confused. "There's only one suite under the reservation," she said. I blinked. He stepped forward smoothly. "That's fine," he said. "We'll manage." I didn't speak. I took the key and followed him up the stairs, each step echoing louder than the last. The room was spacious. One bed, a fireplace, a balcony with wide shuttered doors. I stood by the window, watching the curtains lift with the breeze trying to still the chaos inside me. He set our bags down and opened the minibar. "Wine?" he asked, as if nothing about this was unusual. As if sharing a suite in a secluded inn didn't already carry a weight we both understood too well. I shook my head. Maybe later. We changed for the evening event in silence. I slipped into bar, a simple black dress, low in the back, paired with heels that reminded me how to walk like someone who was looked at. Underneath, I wore the emerald lace. I hadn't planned to, but once I saw it in the suitcase, folded with care, I knew I couldn't leave it behind. When I emerged from the bathroom, he looked up from where he was buttoning his shirt. His eyes lingered, not hungrily, but reverently, like he saw not just the dress, but the woman inside it. I said nothing. I picked up my clutch and walked toward the door. He opened it for me. The event was elegant and forgettable. People spoke in buzzwords, toasts were made. I stood beside him, not touching, but always aware. At one point, someone asked if we were a couple. He answered first, "No, she's married." The way he said it didn't sound like respect, it sounded like restraint. We didn't stay long. An hour, maybe 2. On the way back to the suite, we didn't speak. In the elevator, I stood to his left, watching our reflections in the mirrored walls. I looked like someone I didn't recognize, a woman who had been seen too clearly. In the room, I kicked off my shoes and exhaled. He stood by the door, his jacket already off. We made no plan, no announcement. I walked past him toward the balcony, needing air, needing space. But he followed. And when I turned, he was closer than he should have been. I didn't move away. He reached up and touched the bare skin at the base of my neck, just a brush of fingers. My breath caught. I could feel the question in the air between us. I could also feel the answer. When he kissed me, it wasn't tentative. It wasn't clumsy or rushed. It was slow, deliberate. Like we both already knew what came next, but weren't in a hurry to get there. His hands rested at my waist, anchoring me, not pressing. My own hands hovered, then found his collar, and I leaned into the certainty of his mouth. There was no room for guilt in that moment. Only need, recognition, release. We didn't make love. We didn't cross that final line. But what happened? Between us was no less intimate, no less irrevocable. I remember the warmth of his hands through the fabric of my dress, the weight of his body when he pressed his forehead to mine, the words he didn't say, and I remember thinking, as we lay side by side on the bed without touching, fully clothed and fully undone, that I had just rewritten something in myself, not erased, rewritten. When I returned home the next day, my husband was waiting at the kitchen table. He kissed my cheek. He asked about the trip. I gave him the version he wanted. The wine. The view, the speeches. I told him the room had been comfortable. I told him I'd bring brochures for our next getaway. He smiled. "Maybe we should go next time," I said. That would be nice, but my voice sounded like someone else's, and deep down I already knew we wouldn't. After the trip, the rhythm of our home returned, at least outwardly. Mornings began with the same sequence of gestures. Coffee cups clinking, the sound of the front door unlocking, the quiet drone of a distant conference call through my husband's office door. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I moved through our rooms like a guest in a house I no longer belonged to, wearing familiarity like a borrowed coat I was trying not to stain. My husband didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. He asked if I had slept well, if the meetings had been productive, if I'd had time to visit the vineyard on the hill. I answered with practiced ease, offering just enough detail to satisfy without inviting further curiosity. He smiled when I laughed at his jokes. He touched my back when he passed behind me, in the kitchen. But his hand felt like fabric, not skin. I could no longer feel him, not the way I used to. I caught myself observing him more than I should, how he blinked a little slower when he was tired, how his fingers tapped the table absently when he was lost in thought. He was a good man, I didn't forget that. He wasn't cruel or inattentive or absent. He just wasn't looking anymore. Not really. He lived beside me, not with me. We inhabited the same space but not the same life. The day after we returned, I stripped the bed and changed the sheets. Not because they were dirty, because I couldn't sleep in them without remembering how his hand had found mine in the dark, how his breath had warmed the air between us. I opened the window to let the breeze sweep through the bedroom, but nothing cleared the weight in my chest. He avoided me too, though subtly, no more long glances, no more quiet pauses in the hallway. He didn't join me on the porch, didn't sit beside me during dinner. We exchanged words sparingly. They felt too loud, too fragile. Our silence had morphed into a kind of truce, an agreement not to break what was already cracked. But I felt him everywhere, in the way I dressed, more deliberate now, less out of habit, in the way I styled my hair, paying attention to details I hadn't noticed in years. I chose undergarments not based on comfort, but on how they felt against my skin. I began to stand straighter, move slower, speak softer, not because I was trying to be seen, but because for once, I was fully aware of my own presence. That week, my husband booked us a couple's massage. Thought it might be nice, he said, and smiled like a man trying. I appreciated the gesture, even as it sank like a stone in my stomach. The massage therapist asked us to remove our shirts and lie face down on the table. I watched my husband out of the corner of my eye. His body had aged gently, his shoulders still broad, but his back softer now. He looked peaceful. I felt a twist of guilt, of shame, of nostalgia. And then I felt hands on my back, warm and practiced. Pressing into the tension I hadn't realized I carried in my shoulders, I tried to focus, to enjoy it. But my body didn't respond the way it once did. Every touch felt clinical, not comforting. I thought of another pair of hands, rougher, slower, less trained but more knowing. I kept my eyes closed the entire time, afraid that if I opened them, the truth would spill out of me in gasps and confessions. That night, when we returned home, my husband reached for me in bed. His hand slid across my hip, tentative, searching. I turned toward him. I kissed him. I let him believe I was there. My body obeyed, but my mind was elsewhere, betraying both of us. When it was over, he brushed hair from my face and whispered something soft. I don't remember what. I only remember the echo of his breath and the absence of feeling in my chest. I turned onto my side, away from him, and stared at the wall until morning. Over the next few days, I buried myself in tasks. I organized the pantry, washed curtains, scrubbed tiles I'd ignored for months. I needed movement, friction, noise. I needed something to drown out the quietness of my thoughts. He avoided me. Less, but spoke to me differently, with effort, as though unsure of which version of me he was addressing. The woman who had been his makit for years, or the one who had briefly and silently chosen to be someone else's. One afternoon, I found a book on the coffee table, a poetry collection I didn't recognize. I opened it. On the inside cover, a note in his handwriting. You mentioned this once. I remembered. I closed the book gently, my fingers trembling. That was what undid me. Not the kiss, not the lace, not the shared bed. That note, that memory, that small, careful gesture. He had heard me once in passing, and he remembered. That night, I walked into the kitchen and found him pouring himself water. He looked up. We held each other's eyes for a second too long. I can't keep pretending. "This didn't happen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. I stepped back. But I also can't stop thinking about it. He nodded once, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He didn't touch me. Didn't try to persuade me, he simply said, "Neither can I." And then he walked past me, slowly, deliberately, out of the kitchen and into the dark hallway. Not toward his room, not toward mine, just away. The floor beneath me felt unsteady. My breath felt foreign in my own lungs. Something was ending, but something else was beginning, and neither had a name yet. It was the silence that grew first, not the absence of words, but the presence of something thicker, denser, in every shared glance, every passing moment. My husband and I coexisted, as we always had, but now I noticed the routine for what it truly was. A choreography long rehearsed, performed without feeling. We were two actors stuck in the second act of a play neither of us had the heart to rewrite. In contrast, every second I spent near him, the other him was different. More weighted, more alive. It wasn't just that we had crossed a line, it was that we hadn't stepped back. We lived now in a strange middle ground. Not lovers in the literal sense, but no longer neutral either. Each hallway encounter held tension. Each accidental touch spoke a paragraph neither of us dared say out loud, and I found myself anticipating him. The sound of his steps on the stairs. The way the air changed when he entered the room, it was chemical, it was mental, it was spiritual, it was everything and nothing I had ever expected to feel again. One afternoon, a friend of my husband's stopped by. I hadn't seen him in months. We made small talk in the kitchen while my husband wrapped up a call in the next room. The friend asked me questions with a soft curiosity, the kind you don't hear often after marriage. How I was really doing. If I still painted. If I ever thought of going back to work. I gave him careful answers, layered with truth but wrapped in safety. And then he asked about him. The young man living upstairs. Was it strange, he wondered, to have an adult stepson under the same roof again? I smiled tightly and said something polite. But that question stayed with me. Long after the door closed, long after the shoes were back in the hallway, long into the night, was it strange? Yes, and no. Strange would imply it was unnatural, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like inevitability in disguise. That night, as I stood brushing my hair at the mirror, I saw him in the reflection. He hadn't knocked. He just appeared in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame. We stared at each other through glass, neither speaking. My fingers paused mid-stroke. "You looked tired," he said. I kept brushing. "I haven't been sleeping." He stepped. Inside the room, the light was soft. My robe hung loosely over my frame, tied in a knot that felt increasingly fragile. "I haven't either," he admitted. He came closer, not enough to touch, but enough that I felt it. The gravity, the pull. Turned slowly to face him, the brush still in my hand. "This can't go on," I whispered, though my voice betrayed the ache in me that wished it could. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "It already is." And that was the truth. We weren't deciding to begin anything. We were standing inside something that had already begun. That was the hook, the collapse I couldn't reverse. He left the room before we did anything. And yet, something happened. Something more intimate than touch. He had stood close enough to feel my breath, but far enough to leave me alone with it. That restraint broke me more than any kiss could have. The next day, I tried to re-enter normalcy. I cleaned the refrigerator, paid bills, texted a neighbor about a fundraiser. My hands performed the tasks, but my thoughts refused to stay still. I knew I was lying, not with words, with omission. With my silence, my husband sat at his desk that evening, organizing documents. I watched him from the kitchen, his shoulders hunched, his brow furrowed. I remembered when I used to find that focus attractive. It had once made me feel protected. Now it made me feel small. He came to bed late, crawled under the sheets without turning on the light. We didn't speak. I lay there, staring at the ceiling. the beat of my heart no longer in sync with the room around me. The next morning, I didn't put on my usual robe. I chose something else, a soft ivory camisole I hadn't worn in years, not to seduce, to feel, to remember. I still had a body, that it still responded. Downstairs, he was in the kitchen, already dressed. He didn't look at me right away. When he finally did, it was deliberate. He stared, eyes scanning me slowly, his breath caught in his throat. I said nothing. I poured my coffee. Later that day, I found a small note left on my dresser. 4 words, scrawled in dark ink. We need to talk. No name, no signature. My chest tightened. My pulse slowed. I tucked the note into my drawer. That evening, I waited after my husband went to bed. After the dishwasher stopped humming, after the lights dimmed, he came to me then in the hallway. We didn't speak. He just looked at me, and I nodded. In the guest room, we sat on the edge of the bed, far enough apart to pretend, close enough. To fail, I'm leaving soon, he said quietly. I've been offered a job out of state. I didn't move. You're going to take it? I think I have to. My throat closed. My hands gripped the edge of the mattress. You don't. Want to stay? He exhaled sharply. That's the problem. We sat there for what felt like hours. Not touching, not speaking, just wanting. When I finally stood to leave, he reached out and caught my wrist. Not tightly, just enough to make me pause. I looked down at his hand, then at his face, and then I leaned down, slowly, deliberately, and kissed him. It was a goodbye. And a beginning. All at once, the days that followed moved like slow water, thick, quiet, deceptively still. On the surface, nothing changed. The house remained as it had always been. Coffee in the mornings, the hum of the dishwasher in the afternoons, the distant murmur of my husband's voice from his office upstairs. But beneath it all, the current pulled stronger. I moved through each room like I was memorizing it. My fingers traced the edge of the dining table, the arch of the hallway, the windowsill where the sunlight landed just right in the early hours. I didn't know what I was waiting for, his departure perhaps, or some inner collapse that would finally force a decision. I wasn't sure if I feared it or longed for it. He didn't speak of the job again, and I didn't ask. But I could feel the ticking clock between us, hanging in the air like unsaid words. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, sorting through boxes that hadn't been opened in years. He didn't hear me at first. I stood in the doorway watching him dust off old frames, tools, books with frayed covers. His shirt clung slightly to his back, damp from the weight of the air. He looked like someone already halfway gone. When he noticed me, he straightened and offered a small smile. I returned it, but didn't step closer. We both knew that distance had become a kind of safety net. Flimsy, but necessary. I asked if he needed help. He shook his head, said he was just trying to decide what was worth taking. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my fingers wrapped around the edge of the sheet like it might anchor me. My husband shifted beside me, unaware, untouched. I listened to the wind outside the window, and for a moment, I imagined what it would be like if he were already gone, if the room upstairs were empty, if the only tension left in the house was the kind that came from stillness, not desire. The next morning, I found an envelope on the kitchen counter, my name written on the front in familiar handwriting. Inside, a single page, no greeting, no goodbye, just a sentence. If I stay, I won't survive it. If I go, I don't know who I'll become. I held the paper in my hands for a long time, reading the words again and again, each time feeling them closer to bone. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a confession. It was a fracture laid bare, and suddenly I saw him not just as the man I had crossed a line with, but as someone equally. Undone by it, I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer where I kept old birthday cards and forgotten grocery lists. I made coffee, toasted bread, scrambled eggs. My hands moved as if on script, but my chest was hollow. When my husband came down, I smiled, asked about his meeting, poured his orange juice. He kissed my cheek, thanked me, and never noticed how quiet I had become. Later that afternoon, I walked into the upstairs room without knocking. He was packing. his suitcase half filled, clothes folded with the kind of precision that said he had already done this in his mind a dozen times. He looked up, startled, but didn't speak. "I read your note," I said. He nodded once. I stepped further in, standing at the edge of the bed. The same bed we hadn't shared, but had filled with more honesty than any I'd known in years. My throat tightened. "I don't want you to go," I whispered. His eyes closed briefly. "I know. But you will," I added, not as a question. "Yes." I sat down beside the suitcase, not touching it. My hand rested on my knee, and I stared ahead. "I've never felt more awake than I have with you," I said. "But I can't destroy everything. Not like this." He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He placed one hand on mine, fingers gentle but steady. "I never wanted to destroy you," he said. "Only to see you." And I believed him. That night, I wore the emerald lace one last time. Not for him, not even for me, but because I wanted to remember how it felt, to feel something. I stood in front of the mirror, hair down, shoulders bare, and watched myself with a strange mix of grief and power. Downstairs, the house was quiet. My husband had gone to bed early, exhausted from a week of numbers and deadlines. I walked into the hallway, barefoot, each step quieter than the last. I stopped at the guest room door, now slightly ajar. He sat on the edge of the bed, suitcase closed beside him. When he looked up, our eyes met. We didn't smile. There was no joy in that moment, only recognition, only ache. I stepped forward and he stood, slowly, deliberately. We didn't kiss, we didn't touch. We just stood there, close enough to feel, far enough to remember what we couldn't undo. Then I turned and walked away, back to my room, back to the man who had never hurt me, but had stopped reaching for me a long time ago. I lay down beside him, fully dressed, and closed my eyes. He would leave tomorrow, and I would stay, but neither of us would be the same again. He left on a Tuesday morning, no ceremony, no dramatics. Goodbye. Just a suitcase wheeled quietly through the hallway, a car door closing softly behind him, and the faint sound of an engine receding into the distance. I didn't watch from the window. I stood in the kitchen instead, hands wrapped around, a coffee cup gone cold. The house was silent in a way that didn't feel temporary. It was the silence of something concluded, the kind that doesn't wait to be filled. My husband came down a little later, asking if I'd seen the car keys. I pointed to the side table, answered his questions about breakfast, and nodded through another conversation about work. He mentioned a promotion or maybe a new client. I nodded again. I remember none of the details, but I remember the exact sound of the front door closing behind him. That was the moment it became real. I was alone, not just physically, emotionally, spiritually. That day, I cleaned the guest room. The sheets still smelled faintly of him, mint and wood and something warmer. I stripped the bed, not because it was dirty, but because it felt necessary. Like I was acknowledging an absence that had grown too large to ignore. In the bottom drawer of the nightstand, I found the envelope he had left, not addressed, just sitting there, waiting. Inside, another note, handwritten, just a few lines. "If you ever want to be seen again, you'll know where to find me, but don't come out of guilt. Come because you finally chose yourself." I read it 3 times, then folded it neatly, placed it back in the drawer, and closed it without locking. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not to admire, not even to judge, just to look, to truly see the woman who had walked through fire and desire and silence, the one who hadn't broken, but had changed. I removed my earrings slowly, then my dress. I hung it up with care. Beneath it, I wore simple cotton, no lace, no color, comfort, not spectacle. And still, I felt beautiful. Not because of who had wanted me, not because of who I had wanted, but because I had seen myself clearly, maybe for the first time in years. My husband and I began sleeping at different times after that. He'd stay up late, watching documentaries he never used to care about. I'd wake early, drinking tea before sunrise. We shared meals, shared space. But the thread had thinned between us, and we both sensed it. We no longer fought. There was no fight left in us. Only a mutual, quiet acknowledgement that something had been misplaced. Maybe long before the affair, maybe during it, maybe because of it. He never asked about the tension, never questioned the silences. Maybe he didn't want the truth. Maybe he knew it already. Some nights I would wake and walk to the window, half expecting to see headlights in the driveway, to hear footsteps returning up the front steps. But the driveway remained empty, the guest room untouched, and in time, my body stopped reacting to shadows the same way. My breath evened, my pulse slowed. One afternoon, I pulled out a suitcase. The same one I had packed for the weekend trip that changed everything. I opened it on the bed, not to fill it, but to look. To remember the woman who had zipped it up believing she was still in control of her life. Inside was the emerald lingerie, folded, untouched. Since that night, I picked it up, ran my fingers over the stitching. For a moment, I held it against me, pressing the fabric to my chest, and then gently, I laid it back down. I didn't need it anymore, not to feel desired, not to feel awake, not to feel myself. In the weeks that followed, I started walking again, around the neighborhood, into town, past the bookstore I hadn't stepped inside since before the affair. I even bought a journal, nothing fancy, just paper and a pen, but it felt like the beginning of something I hadn't yet named. One day, I passed a mirror in a shop window. I paused, looked, and this time, I didn't just see the face of a wife or a woman marked by guilt, or a shadow of someone else's longing. I saw someone honest, bruised but honest. I didn't reach out to him. Not yet. Maybe I never would. But the note stayed in the drawer, and I stayed with myself. Fully, finally, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough.